The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to Urban Fantasies, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic, and folklore. And now here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
It's Thursday night, it's late, and hello to all our listeners in Paranormal Radio Land. I'm Charles Christian, and with me is Janie.
Hi everyone, yes, it's Thursday, 5th October, and here in the Northern Hemisphere, there's a hunter's moon tonight.
A hunter's moon? Tell me more.
Well, the hunter's moon is the first full moon after harvest moon, which we had last month. Hunter's moon was named as it signified a time of easy hunting, even deep into the night, to prepare for the long winter ahead. It's also called a blood moon because of the orange-red glow it has due to the late autumn atmosphere, although it may also have earned its name, as in olden times, the annual slaughter of all but breeding stock took place at this time of year. It's also called the shedding moon or the falling leaf moon. Anyway, enough about the moon. What else happened on this weird day in history, the 5th of October?
To be honest, not a lot. In 1962 was the year the 60s first started swinging, as it saw the release of both the Beatles' first single Love Me Do and the first James Bond movie, Dr. No. And for lovers of 60s trivia, this day in 1969 also saw the first airing of the first episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus on BBC TV. However, on a more serious note, there is one weird what-if moment in history that took place on this day. In 1916, during the Battle of the Somme during the First World War, a young Adolf Hitler was wounded in the thigh by shrapnel from an exploding shell. But what if that wound had been a few inches in the other direction? What if the wound had been fatal? Would it have meant the Nazi Party would have never risen to power in Germany? Would it have meant no Second World War? Would it have meant the world would have been saved from the horrors of the death camps and the Holocaust? Would it also have meant Stalin's Russia was unable to overrun Eastern Europe and bury it behind an Iron Curtain for 50 years? There's a lot of ifs here that could have totally rewritten world history, but it didn't happen. Hitler recovered from his injuries, and the rest is history.
That's an extraordinary thought. And while we're on sombre topics, I'm guessing you are now going to tell us about today's hauntings, but hopefully no more ghosts of poor souls who were tortured to death in hideous ways like the ones we had last time.
Unfortunately, being killed in hideous ways does tend to be an essential part of the job description for becoming a ghost. However, if it's any consolation, both of today's ghosts died relatively quickly. Our first ghost is that of Andrew McAllister, a Highland warrior who died at the Battle of Glenlivet in Moray, Scotland, in 1594. This was a battle between Clan Gordon and their allies, who supported the Roman Catholic cause, and Clan Campbell and their allies, who supported the Protestants. Both sides believed they had God on their side, but the Gordon Highlanders also had plenty of cannons, with the first shot decapitating poor Andrew McAllister. Now, on the evening of every 3rd of October, the Glenlivet battlefield is haunted by the headless ghost of McAllister, riding on a ghostly horse, searching for his head. Our second ghost, who walks on the evening of every 7th of October, and has been doing so for the past 12 centuries, is St. Osyth, who haunts St. Osyth's Priory in the English county of Essex. St. Osyth has one feature in common with Andrew McAllister, namely she is also missing her head. In her case, she was decapitated by Viking raiders. Unlike McAllister, St. Osyth found her head. In fact, according to her legend, after being decapitated, she climbed back on her feet, picked up her head and walked with it in her hands to the door of the convent she'd founded before finally collapsing there and dying.
Did you know that Saint Osyth is what is known as a cephalophoric martyr? That's saints killed by being beheaded who carry their heads with them. There are over 130 of them in France alone. The best known is St Denis, the patron saint of Paris, who walked for 7 miles before finally dying.
Amazing. I can't even walk 7 miles with my head in the right place. Of course, the UK's most famous headless ghost is Anne Boleyn, who not only haunts several locations, but even had a song written about her. With her head tucked underneath her arm, she walks the bloody tower. Incidentally, there is also a report of a ghost of a white lady being seen standing next to a washing machine at St Osyth Priory when the current building was being used as a nursing home. I'm guessing the juxtaposition of the ghost and the washing machine is purely coincidental, as distinct from some kind of paranormal product replacement. You white lady ghosts will be whiter than white if you wash your ghost in Brandex washing powder. Anyway, moving swiftly on from ghost to folklore, I bet you're really excited about next Sunday, Janie.
Why? What's happening? Are we going shopping?
No, but it's the annual World Conker Championship.
Oh, right.
Yeah, to be honest, I can't say I blame you. It's very much a boy thing, and I was useless at conkers at school. All those processes for hardening them, baking them, soaking them in vinegar. Let's not forget stabbing ourselves in the hand and leg as we used a skewer to try and drill a hole through them so we could string them. There are also some very strange rituals associated with the game. For example, if someone knocks your conker out of your hand and it falls on the floor, if they shout "Stampsies," they are entitled to stamp on it and crush it. That is, unless you shout "Bagsies, no stampies" first. The scoring is equally arcane. If you have a new conker, it is a nonner. If you win your first game by breaking your opponent's equally new conker, it becomes a oner. However, if I then go on to beat someone who has a threer conker, because they've won 3 previous wins, my conker becomes not a twoer, but a fiver, as it also insulates their score. Doesn't make sense to me. Incidentally, when you prepare to take your swing with a new conker, you should say the following rhyme. Iddy iddy onka, my first conker. Iddy iddy oh, my first go. Actually, what is really weird about the game of conkers is, despite all this ritual, the first recorded game of conkers using horse chestnuts, in other words the modern game, is only as recently as 1848. Although before that there were similar games being played using snail shells and hazelnuts.
Nope, still don't get it. However, I've been looking into the folklore of conkers, and here are 5 other things you can do with a conker. No, not that. Apparently, spiders hate conkers. So if you collect fresh conkers and place them near windows and doorways, spiders will avoid your home for the winter. And if they're already there, they'll leave. Just pop one behind the furniture or leave in corners of a room. I'm not sure how this will work with spiders on a sink or a bath, though. Other pieces of magical folklore include: carry a conker to attract good luck, carry to help ease and stave off aches and pains, leave a conker in your home and it will attract money, thread with string and hang conkers in wardrobes to keep moths away. So that's 4 conkers we need straight off.
I'll get onto it straight away. Thanks, Janie. We'll be hearing more from you later on in the show.
You're listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Time now for some more practical magic, and tonight we have a spell to help drive away bad dreams and give you an undisturbed night's sleep. The spell uses herbal magic to cleanse a bedroom of negative influence, and, since you want something taken away from you, the spell is at its most potent if performed under a waning moon, which this month starts on Saturday the 7th October and continues through until the 17th. You will need the following items for this spell: a bowl of warm water, some salt, common or garden kitchen salt is fine, some sprigs of the herbs rosemary and sage. The rosemary will bring clarity while the sage is for wisdom. And finally, a piece of string or garden twine. Once again, nothing fancy is required. Now, dissolve the salt in the warm water. Tie the herbs together, then dip the sprigs in the water, and as you recite the following spell, and I'll give you the spell in a moment, use the sprigs to gently, and I mean gently, we don't want you soaking your bedding and going to sleep between damp sheets, gently sprinkle the salt water on the corners of your room, of your bedclothes, and around the head and foot of your bed. When you have done this, place the herbs under your pillow. The next morning, discard the herbs at a crossroads if you can, by crumbling the sprigs between your hands and allowing the fragments to disperse to the four winds. Alternatively, ensure you have carried them far away from your home before you discard them. This will carry all negativity away from your home, your bedroom, and your bed. Now, here's that spell. Spirits of the night, I beseech thee, bring me the power, grant me the right to sleep soundly and peacefully, without fear or fright, throughout this long night. Incidentally, rosemary is also known as the friendship bush. If you have it growing in your garden, you'll never be short of friends, and it will apparently also protect you from malevolent witches. So let us begin our journey. Keep your eyes peeled for scarecrows, horn dancers and corn rigs, hamlets, fates and villages, black-eyed dogs, hanging trees, and the mist rising in fields of blackberries, weeping willows, the rolling of the stones, and the great god Pan sat upon his throne. And beware all that goes on beyond the witch elm, for this is the season of the witch. Those lines come from the introduction to a new book, Harvest Hymns, The Twisted Roots and Sweet Fruits of Folk Horror Music. I'm now going to talk to Jim Peters, one of the driving forces behind this new book. By way of background, Jim is a collections manager at the British Museum. He's been an archaeologist, and he's always interested in what the past can teach us. He's also been involved in the folk horror revival group in the UK from the outset. Yeah, if you can explain to me, Jim, for people who aren't familiar with it, what exactly is folk horror?
Well, I will try, I will attempt. The problem with, it's not a problem, but one of the things with folk horror is that the folk horror of which the folk horror revival is the group that I'm a part of, but the original folk horror wasn't really a sort of a conscious movement. It just so happened, I think, that a kickback of the failure of some of the hippie ideals, and there was off the back of that, there was a resurgence with the occult, interest in the occult, and whereas people had looked to India and China for their spiritual guidance during the hippie movement, when that didn't seem to have the payoff that people wanted, people started looking more at home, and you had in '69 you had John Mitchell released the book The View Over Atlantic, which kind of revived the old straight track idea of ley lines and earth mysteries, and
yes.
People started to look more at home at the folklore traditions and ancient religions on our own shores, rather than looking for some sort of guidance from elsewhere. And I think that was probably a natural progression after the excitement of the hippie movement sort of petered out a bit. So people still had an interest in earthy things, and were a very anti-establishment vibe, but I think they were looking closer to home for that rather than looking outside. Mm-hmm. And I think probably the best way to show how that manifested itself really is for most people, if you mention folk horror, if they have an understanding of it, at the very basics, normally involves three films, the unholy trilogy, if you like, and that's The Wicker Man, The Witchfinder General, and Blood on Satan's Claw. And but none of those three films were made as folk horror, although Piers Haggard in a later interview did say when he was making Blood on Satan's Claw, he was looking to make some sort of folk horror film. That's probably one of the earliest instances of the use of the phrase. So these were things that were being made independently, but looking at them from hindsight, you can see that they all have these same tropes which come to define folk horror. You know, they have an isolation within a vast landscape, or an isolation, you know, on Summer Island, Wicker Man, that community is isolated within that landscape. The landscape is what is holding that community together because they're on an island, they can't go anywhere. Witchfinder generally, it's these very, very vast vistas. It's often been described as like a western. It's got these huge plains with trees, with like tree lines with horses galloping between them, and it's this sense that the landscape is what is holding everything together. So the films all have this very sense of landscape and how that affects the people that live within it. And then that also affects this kind of skewed moral beliefs of these people. So again, on Summer Island, Wicker Man, because these kind of people are isolated, they've come up with their own interpretation and their own set of moral beliefs, which is fine until someone comes in from the outside, places themselves in that environment, and then suddenly that's when things seem to fall apart. So those are those tropes of like an isolation of people within a powerful landscape. And that creates a kind of a skewed sort of set of beliefs and a skewed sort of moral values that are very much the tropes of folk horror. So it's not specifically horrific, you know, it's not a slasher film, it's not gore. The horror comes from elsewhere. I mean, Robert Macfarlane wrote about a trope he called English Eerie, which is not that dissimilar to folk horror, really. And he commented that it's the form of fear that's felt first as unease, then as dread, and which is incited as glimpse and tremors rather than outright attack. And I think you can see that as a description of those three films. You know, there is no outright horror in there, but there's this ever-growing sense of dread and unease. But it wasn't just within the films. You know, the filmmakers and the writers that were inspired to make those films, what was inspiring them, the same inspirations and the same constructs were also at work within literature and music and TV at the time. So this was a completely independent thing. This wasn't a movement. It just so happened that people had come out of the same set of influences through the 60s folk music and the sort of expansion of esoteric beliefs. They came through that, and that inspired their creativity. So you had the likes of Alan Garner and Nigel Neal churning out sort of their weird fiction, which was very much rooted in folklore. And even down to children's television, you know, the Children of the Stones and the Owl Service, which were these very, very strange TV programs made in the 70s, were made by people who'd been influenced by that folk music and folklore revival that came off the back of the hippie movement. And these are programs, I mean, I don't know if you're aware of Children of the Stones or the Owl Service. They're two programs that wouldn't be made today. You know, the time was right for us to treat children that way and expose them to these things. And so they all have the same ideas. Though you look at Children of the Stones, and it's a community trapped within a stone circle. You know, there's that sense of isolation again, they're trapped by the landscape. And because they're trapped there, they've again got this skewed moral beliefs. They've come up with this weird belief system where everyone's almost, you know, sort of isolated in their own brains. They've become sort of zombies from the power of the earth. So again, it's similar tropes coming through, completely independently of each other. You know, this wasn't a movement. This was just people who were being informed from the same inspirations. Yeah. So I think that's kind of the original folk horror. It wasn't a thing at the time. It's been called folk horror since.
Yeah, just coming in on that. Is there an equivalent? I mean, I know on the Facebook group there's a lot of interest from America, but is there a similar folk horror movement in America? I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is very much English or Scottish type of...
This is it. I mean, at first it was, when the group was set up, it was a very British sort of view of folk horror. But it was now we've got a much more world view of that, and that's kind of the blessing of, you know, the contact through the internet. But I mean, there is, and if you look at a lot of the kind of the backwards horror, I don't mean backwards. I mean the backwoods of America horror, where again, it's someone isolated within this vast landscape, and the landscape is almost another character in the film. You can get a film like Deliverance or Night of the Hunter, which has this sense that people are trapped by what's around them, and again, because of their environment and because of their isolation, their beliefs, their opinions are getting skewed to quite perverse sort of extremes. So there is examples of that in America. It takes on a slightly different form because I don't think they have the same sort of folkloric traditions as us, but it's definitely there. And that's one of the exciting things about folk horror revival is seeing the expansion of the term. Those films are very much, they have that kind of that rural feel to them. But then you could even look at the likes of Quatermass, Nigel Kneale, and I mean, for me, I always think the Children of the Damned has a real kind of folk horror feel to it, despite the fact it's set, it's in an urban setting. Yeah. Because when you think it's these children, there's a power that's drawing these children along lines to one central point. It's almost got that ley line feel to it, and they all commune at some sacred spot. They're all holed up in a church, and they're trapped in there. And it almost becomes a kind of a Lord of the Flies thing where they're trapped in there and they set up their own hierarchy and beliefs, independent of the outside world. And it ticks a lot of the folk horror thing. So it's interesting to see how once you start looking at it, it expands, and it's not just a kind of a British folktale tradition. It's bled elsewhere as time's gone on. Even down to something like Blair Witch and Kill List, more modern films have a real folk horror vibe to them. You're glimpsing things. There's not necessarily any outright horror. It glimpses, it builds up, and then suddenly you get at the end, you get that moment, in The Wicker Man, that final scene where suddenly you realise what's been going on, and you get that in all these other films. You've just been teased the whole way along. And I mean, I think just to finish up how I see folk horror before moving on to other questions, I think this is one, it's a very basic generalisation, but this might help people understand that, and I use this in the book, that if you're walking down a country lane at night with high bushes on either side and you're alone and you can hear those sounds in the hedgerows and you can hear far off sounds in the distance, that sense of unease, that sense of the heightened sensations and the slight sort of paranoia and that feeling that you're one person very small alone in a very vast landscape, that's the feeling of folk horror. Whereas walking down that country lane at night in exactly the same circumstances, when suddenly someone runs out from behind a bush with a dirty great knife and chases you down the road, that's horror. That's the difference. There is none of that violence, aggression. In folk horror, it's about how in fact, it's a very, very personal thing. I think that's why maybe it's a difficult thing to explain, because it's a personal reaction to things.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Now, let's talk about the new book, Harvest Hymns.
Yeah, okay. Well, this came out of... we had a book a couple of years ago. The Folk Horror Revival Group have now set up a publishing wing, and we did our first book, which was Field Studies, which was a collection of essays and interviews. Yes. And we were looking at doing Field Studies 2 straight off the back of that. And I sort of said, well, I'll write an article for it about folk horror music. And then I jokingly kind of said, mind you, actually, that's probably a book in its own right. And someone said, yeah, you're right, you should do it. And I thought, yeah, I can do that. So that's how it came about. And I suddenly realised that it's a massive subject. And the biggest struggle that I had with it is folk horror music is not folk and it's not horror. It's not necessarily music that has a folk music feel and background and sound. And it's not music that is horrific. So trying to write about a book and get across to people that folk horror music is not defined by those two words was very tricky. So it's quite a diverse book, I think. I think it covers quite a lot of material in the aim that people will then be able to draw their own conclusions about folk horror music. Really, that's the idea.
What was your background or interest in music then that brought you to it? Were you involved in folk groups or anything like that?
Well, I grew up in a house. My mother would listen to Scottish folk music all the time. Mm-hmm. That was pretty much all she used to listen to. And my father was his was classical music. So I grew up listening to Mussorgsky and Beethoven. So I had these. So from my mum, I get the folklore and the folk side of it, and from my dad, I get the dramatic, bombastic kind of classical swells. You know, I love that. That's slightly the darker classical music. So that was my background. I've been in bands at school, and I've been in bands as a teenager with my brothers, and we'd gigged and we'd had a few CDs out, but nothing ever came of it. But I started to mix other people's music together. I'd always DJ'd, but I like to DJ by mixing really different styles together. And I used to get like records of the Moon Landing and spoken word tours of London and play that over records. Yeah. And gradually that became, I went through a period of without going too much, I went into a period of where I wasn't sleeping for a very long time, insomnia. And so one of the ways I got through that was to sit up and create these mixes. And because of the kind of the nocturnal setting of that, they were quite dark and spooky. Mm-hmm. People would describe them as a soundtrack to particularly sort of scary Halloween party. And I kind of started to explore music that had, in folk music, in film scores, all sorts, that had a kind of a dark, haunting feel to it. And this is before I even knew of folk horror. And through that, I got to meet a lot of people. People started sending me music saying, I really like your mixes, you might want to use this. And I gradually built up a network of people who now are, I would count as all part of the folk horror movement. So that was kind of my background. I'd built up a big sort of web of connections through putting these mixes out. I do mixes under the name Melmoth the Wanderer. Right. And I ended up remixing albums for people and producing albums for people. So I had a traditional kind of music background, and then it ended up with me exploring what could be done at home on my laptop with other people's music. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that's my background, and that's how I think that's how I got recruited.
You're listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
You kindly sent me a PDF of the manuscript. It's huge. I mean, over 300 pages and masses of 60 or so, over 60 separate stories in there. Features, interviews, articles in there. It's a massive piece of work you've done there, and covering everything. I can see, you've got scoring M.R. James. You've got a section on Robert Johnson and going down to the Crossroads. You've got all the bands of my school and university days, incredible string band, Steel Eye Span, and so on. The sort of second folk music revival type era. Yeah, it's massive.
Well, yeah. I mean, I just to point out, it's not all penned by me.
No.
Yeah, I sort of. I have the lion's share of the articles, and I curated it, I guess you would say.
Yes.
But I'm very lucky through my connections that I have and the people that I know to have some very, very wise people who were instantly willing to be part of the project. And I also had a list of people that I wanted to contact who I kind of thought, I wonder if we'll get anything here. And pretty much all of them were instantly. One of the people I wanted to talk to, there was a chap called Johnny Trunk, who was the person that kind of tracked down the Wicker Man soundtrack and actually put the Wicker Man soundtrack out. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it to listen to other than record it off the video. Yeah. And I asked him if he'd like to write a review about the album, and he's written a lovely one about what it meant to him to watch it at night when he came back from the pub with his mates, and then how long it took him to track the soundtrack down. And then I discovered that one of my best friends, his wife, her uncle, a bit complicated, is John Cameron, who wrote the soundtrack to Kes and Psychomania, and he's an award-winning composer. He rescored Les Mis, and so I thought, well, I'll try him, and straight away he was like, no, yeah, of course, I'm on board. And you mentioned M.R. James. I was intrigued by the idea that the Jonathan Miller, Whistle and I'll Come to You, doesn't have a score, but when it was remade, the John Hurt version, it does have a score. So I contacted the composer of that and asked him, how do you go up against such a classic version that doesn't have a score, and create one yourself? So lots of different people who I was just firing off. I wonder if I can talk to that person. And just amazed how many people were willing to be part of it. So that's why. That's why it's so big, because pretty much everybody I spoke to was willing to be involved. So I was very lucky to have that amount of material on offer. So, and what I did is I contacted, I think about 20 people and said, would you just write a review of your favourite album you consider folk horror? And some of these people were not part of the folk horror revival, so they have a very different take on it, which is really nice. You get people, you get some review. And what I've tried to do is every few articles, I put one of those reviews in to try and break up the book. And I think it's really nice to see people's different take on what makes a folk horror album. That wasn't something that that was free reign. It was like, you pick an album, you write the review, it's your interpretation of it, and that's what will go in. So I'm hoping that it will help people, make their minds up as to what they consider to be folk horror music.
And the other thing, reading through the book, is that realization that a lot of the songs, if you like, are wasted on you when you're young because you don't really understand the hidden meanings in them. And as you look at them, listen to them later, you realise, John Barleycorn is about the circle of the year and growing corn and things. It's not a slightly strange murder song that you can't quite make sense of. Yeah,
exactly, and that's great because there have been quite a few articles submitted, especially about the sort of the Southern murder ballads, which look into that. And there's a great, very in-depth article about the child ballads, which look at them. And again, these are a lot of these songs that I knew and I'd heard growing up, and I could wander around the house singing along to them, knowing all the words. But it's now, as you say, it was almost wasted then. I listen to them now and I think about the words now, and suddenly the story is there. I understand it, and it has a place, it has an importance, it has a resonance that it didn't before. And it's nice to be able to get that through in the book, I think, because that's part of the whole idea of folk horror. Is if it's a personal interpretation and a personal feeling towards something. So, if we can assist with that by taking people down paths they've not been down before, then that's a good thing, I think.
Brilliant. Yeah. Yes.
I mean, you mentioned John Barley.
Yes.
And I just find that's an interesting one because on the surface, it's got that talks of suffering and death, and drinking of the blood, and it's very much linked to, as you say, the circle of the year, and it's a very sort of it's a classic folklore song. I mean, what was it? Burns in the late 1700s wrote it, but it existed before that. Mm-hmm. But I've always had a slight. It's one of those ones that I'm not sure myself whether I would count that as folk horror, because all the versions are really nice. It doesn't have that. It doesn't have that slightly dark. There's one version, a band called Fire and Ice recorded version, which has dark overtones. But the music, I mean, Traffic's version is a lovely version, and and that's what I'm trying to do with the book, to try and understand, what makes something folk horror.
Yeah.
And I know I mentioned Rolling of the Stones, and the Rolling of the Stones is a lovely song. And in my opinion, it doesn't become folk horror until it takes on that kind of the supernatural. We get the lines, until she came to her true love's grave and began to charm, and she charms the fish and the birds. And that's when the song goes from being a folk song to taking on something else.
Yes.
It's got another worldly feel to it. It's got something that goes back to the beginning, not the beginning of time, but it goes back to a power we might not understand. It's something that we have chosen to ignore in our current sort of society, but these folk songs remind us of these ancient beliefs and these ancient powers, and I think that's quite an important part of folk horror. So it's hopefully the book will help not just me but everybody else sort of come to some conclusions about what folk horror is as a musical form, anyway.
Yeah. When is the book going to be published?
Well, we're hoping it's going to be before Christmas. It's finished.
Yeah.
But we just have, what happens is all of our books through the Weird Harvest Press, which is the folk horror revival press, are done, it's self-published, and it's by a company, I think they're an American company. When you order the book, they print it. So we don't have a back stock. And that way we're able to, 100% of the money, all of it goes to the Woodland Trust. So it's 100% charity. So it's, although the book is done, it's still got to go being formatted to the way that they will then eventually publish it. In fact, they'll publish it as an A5 book, which means it goes from being 300 to 50 to 700 pages. So it's going to be an even bigger book.
Right.
So we're hoping that will be, by December.
Mm-hmm. And people who follow Folk Horror Revival on Facebook, you'll be posting it up there, presumably, first of all.
Yeah, I mean, we started off as a Facebook page, thinking we would only get a couple of hundred people. We've now got over 20,000 people worldwide. But we also have Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram. We have our own blog site. So it will, when it's released, it will be promoted through all of those. And I have a couple of bookshops in London that are interested in, although it's only printed when you buy it, they're interested in stocking it. So we will post that up and let people know where they can get it and how they can get it when it comes out. Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to add? Because it's been fascinating. But
well, I think the thing that to add, I mean, I obviously spoke at length about folk horror, but I think, and we've mentioned the Facebook group Folk Horror Revival, but one thing I'm very, very strong feeling about in the group is that it's that word revival, because as I said, we look back and we group a whole load of things together as folk horror in the same way that you look back and group folk music together. These old songs weren't originally done as folk songs. That was just an old tradition that we look back on and call folk music now, in the same way that we look back at that movement in the 60s and the 70s that was producing these TV programs and books and films and say that's folk horror. And what the group is about, it's not a group that looks at that and strokes its chin and nods approvingly and says that's wonderful and we love that stuff. But there is a degree of that. But the idea is that the whole point of the revival is that we're trying to inspire people with that work in the same way that the folk music revival was inspired by the earlier folk movement. We want people to look at those works of folk horror and use that to inspire new creations. And within the group, we've got lots of musicians who are constantly putting out new music, but they're putting it out as folk horror music. It's a label now. There's films that are coming out from members of the group. We've got an event coming up in Edinburgh later this year, and we've got the preview of a film about Orley Rectory is going to be shown there for the first time. At the event at the British Museum, we had 2 filmmakers showing their films. We had poetry, we had music, and we've even graphic novels. There's such a sort of an amazing well of talent out there, and the Folk Revival group isn't just there to look back at things that we have classified as folk horror and discuss their attributes. It's there to inspire people and encourage people to create a new version of the folk horror for today, because there's different social concerns now than there were in the 60s and 70s. The planet's a very different place, society is very different, but though the tropes of the isolation, the landscape, and all of those are still there, it's interesting to see how that gets interpreted nowadays. So that's one thing I've always been very keen on, is that it's a proactive group. It's not an appreciation society. It is a revival. It is there to encourage and inform and inspire people.
That sounds brilliant.
Okay.
Right, Jim Peters, thank you very much indeed. That was great.
That's quite all right. Thank you very much.
Jim Peters there. Jim, by the way, says he's always had an interest in music. More than an interest, I'd say. If you go on Mixcloud and look under Melmoth the Wanderer, that's the name Jim uses for his ambient sound, hauntology type mixes. See if you can catch the Fro mix, which is particularly autumnal feel to it. It also includes the classic Traffic version of the song John Barleycorn. Mind you, if we're talking about classic bands who have a mystical side to their music. Led Zeppelin, I think, fits the bill there, as some of their back catalogue takes you through the whole range of pagan, Nordic, mystic, occult music. They've got the Led Zeppelin 4 album, the Zozo album, got tracks like Ramble On, Misty Mountain, Hop, No Quarter, The Battle of Evermore, of course Stairway to Heaven, The Immigrant Song, Achilles' Last Stand, and Kashmir. Kashmir, incidentally, includes my favourite misheard musical lyric. Actual words are, to sit with elders of the gentle race. But I've always thought it was said, to sit with Elvis of the gentle face. Never mind. That's called a mondegreen. It's a term an American writer, Sylvia Wright, coined in the 1950s after noticing her mother would recite a book of poems to her, and one of the lyrics, one of the lines, she always misunderstood. The actual line is, "They ha' slain the Earl Murray and laid him on the green." Unfortunately, she misunderstood the lines and read "and laid him on the green" as Lady Mondegreen, hence the phrase mondegreen. Well, you learn something all the time.
Find us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or email us at urbanfantasist@icloud.com or follow us on Twitter at urban_fantasist.
Get in the car, make yourself comfortable, as we're now heading off to the UK's second city, Birmingham, for a quick urban myth-busting road trip. First myth is that Birmingham has more miles of canal than Venice. Sounds fanciful, but it actually turns out to be true. Venice has a total of 26 miles of canal, while Birmingham runs ahead with 35 miles. And if you take into account the entire Birmingham Canal navigation system, a network of waterways connecting Birmingham, Wolverhampton and the eastern part of the Black Country, that has a total of 114 miles of navigable water. Now for another little urban myth. There was a gypsy curse on Birmingham City football ground. It's claimed that in 1906 a 100-year gypsy curse was placed on St Andrews, the ground of Birmingham City Football Club, by Romanis who were angry at being evicted from the site so the new stadium could be built there. This actually would appear to be true, as one manager was apparently so worried that he painted the bottoms of players' boots bright red and hung crucifixes on the floodlights, while another claimed he urinated in all 4 quadrants in a bid to rid the curse. The curse ended at dawn on Boxing Day in the year 2006, and the team went on to win their home fixture against Queen Park Rangers that very same day. So perhaps there is something in the gypsy curse. Now heading into the realms of fantasy fiction. Is there a connection between Tom Bombadil and Birmingham? This is also true, and the area of the city, known as Moseley Bog, was apparently the author J.R.R. Tolkien's inspiration for the old forest where Tom Bombadil lived in the Fellowship of the Ring. Back to the gypsies. Was Charlie Chaplin born in a gypsy caravan in Smethwick? Another unlikely myth, but it might be true. It's said Chaplin's daughter Victoria found a letter making the claim that he was born in a caravan belonging to a gypsy queen on the Black Patch in Smethwick, on the border of Birmingham. However, as there's no official record of the comic actor's birth anywhere in any country, this may have to go down as unconfirmed. Going back in time now to the 18th century, did Birmingham once have a group who met at full moon and called themselves the Lunatics? Again, yes. A number of prominent industrialists, inventors, scientists and philosophers, including Matthew Boulton and Charles Darwin's grandfather, used to meet in the region between 1765 and 1813. They called themselves the Lunar Circle and then later the Lunar Society of Birmingham. They did indeed get together when there was a full moon. However, this was because of the extra light from the moon made their nighttime journeys home safer and easier in the days before street lamps. but because they met during the full moon, they did refer to themselves as the lunatics. Now a quiz question about a quiz. Cluedo, was it invented in Birmingham? Again, it's true. The murder mystery board game was invented in 1944 by Anthony Pratt, a solicitor's clerk from Birmingham. He originally called the game Murder. However, he presented the game to Waddingtons, who rebranded it as Cluedo, and it went on sale in 1949 and continues to sell to this day. Now for a slightly more arcane story. Birmingham is the birthplace of custard. Well, also true. Although custard made by mixing milk and eggs and thickening it over heat had been invented in the Middle Ages, it was a certain Alfred Bird who developed the modern egg-free version in 1837 because his wife was allergic to eggs. Bird instead used cornflour-based powder added to milk. When he discovered his custard was so popular, he formed the company Alfred Bird and Sons. Finally, the Peaky Blinders gangsters were a thing. There's a BBC crime drama called The Peaky Blinders. The 4th series is due to air in 2018, next year, about some gangsters who roamed the streets of Birmingham in the years after the First World War. They supposedly took their name from the fact they stitched cutthroat razors in the peaks of their caps and used them as weapons. A bit like Oddjob in the Goldfinger movie. However, this is busted. The razors in the caps is just pure fiction, not least as you risk slicing your own fingers off every time you put on and took off your hat. That said, all caps in those days, and in the Birmingham area they used to be called peakies, had hard peaks. That definitely could inflict injury on you if someone head-butted you. Yes, there was actually a gang called the Small Heath Peaky Blinders. They operated in the 1890s and had all vanished long before the start of the First World War. Oh, and the members were not as old or as good-looking as the gangsters in the TV series. One gang leader, in fact, was arrested at the grand old age of 13 for carrying a gun.
A legend or a folklore tale. When did it start? It's fascinating that we can look back on 10 centuries of history and pinpoint when an event was first recorded. I'm reading here from our very own host's book, A Travel Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolds by Charles Christian. Wolds, by the way, are gentle rolling hills in England. Here's 3 tales from just one small mound near Wold Newton, which is at the heart of Charles's book, dealing with a strange and wonderful place called the Wold Newton Triangle. The mound, or barrow, is about 25 feet high and due to heavy excavation now looks more like a small volcano, but covered with trees. The mound is called Willie Howe, and the first legend is about a movable treasure chest. It was apparently found by a farmer turned treasure hunter who dug away the earth from the mound until he located a large chest filled with gold. He then had a train of horses, supposedly extending upwards of 1/4 of a mile, attached to it by strong iron traces, and was just on the verge of hauling the treasure chest out of the mound when he unwisely called out, "Hop Perry, prow Mark, whether God's will or not, we'll have this ark." And by the standards of the day, these words were regarded as awful blasphemy. And no sooner had he spoken than all the traces broke and the chest sunk still deeper in the hill, where it still remains to this day. All the farmer's subsequent efforts to recover it proved in vain. The second legend tells of a fairy who had a crush on a local man. She wanted to help him, so she told him that if he came to the top of the Howe early every morning to meet her, he would find a guinea waiting for him when he departed. The one caveat was that he must never tell anyone where his money came from. For some time he did exactly as she said, and as his money grew, he was able to live in increasing comfort. His friends were surprised and grew suspicious about his newfound wealth, not least because he was so secretive about its source. Eventually he shared his secret with one of his friends, and in the morning he took him to the mound to show him the guinea that would be there. But there was no money that morning, nor ever again. The tale says he met with a severe punishment for betraying the fairies' trust, being beaten up by invisible fists, and forever after he was cursed to be unlucky. The third and final legend associated with Willie Howe, and probably the best known, was first recorded by a William of Newburgh, and there's more about this extraordinary 12th century chronicler later in Charles's book. According to William, and this is in his words, in the province of Deira, and not far from the place of my nativity, an extraordinary event occurred, which I have known from my childhood. There is a village some miles distant from the Eastern Ocean, and that is actually what we now call the North Sea, near which those famous waters, commonly called gypsy, spring from the ground at various sources. He continues, a certain rustic belonging to the village, going to see his friend, who resided in the neighbouring hamlet, was returning a little intoxicated late at night, riding on horseback, it should be noted, when, behold, he heard, as it were, the voice of singing and revelling on an adjacent hillock, that is the Willie Howe Barrow, which I have often seen, and which is distant from the village only a few furlongs. Wondering who could be thus disturbing the silence of midnight with noisy mirth, he was anxious to investigate the matter more closely, and perceiving in the side of the hill an open door, he approached, and looking in, he beheld a house spacious and lighted up, filled with men and women who were seated, as it were, at a solemn banquet. One of the attendants, perceiving him standing at the door, offered him a cup. Accepting it, he wisely forbore to drink, but pouring out the contents, but retaining the vessel, he quickly departed. It seems he may have been drunk, but this rustic, a local farmer, knew that if he drank the wine, he risked being enchanted and taken prisoner by the fairies. Anyway, a tumult arose among the company on account of the stolen cup, and the guests pursued him. But he escaped by the fleetness of his steed and reached the village with his extraordinary prize. I think the farmer and his horse escaped by leaping over the gypsy race beck, thereby putting fast-moving water between him and his pursuers, because they, being fairies, were unable to cross the flowing stream. Anyway, according to William of Newburgh, and his story is echoed almost verbatim by another medieval chronicler, Gervase of Tilbury, the stolen fairy cup was a vessel of unknown material, unusual colour and strange form, which was offered as a great present to King Henry I. He reigned from 1100 to 1135, who then gave it to his brother-in-law, King David of Scotland, who kept it in his treasury for many years. William of Newburgh goes on to say that he had heard from a reliable source that a few years since, King Henry II of England, he reigned 1154 to 1189, had asked to see it and was given it as a gift by the then Scottish monarch, King William I. William of Newburgh's story is particularly interesting because not only is he recounting a tale that he was personally familiar with as a child growing up in that area, but it's also one of the earliest, if not the first account of fairy activity in English history, predating all the folklore stories and fairy tales captured and written down by the Brothers Grimm and the Victorians in the 19th century by about 700 years. Finally, Willie Howe is also another location in the Wold-Newton Triangle where if you run round the mound 9 times without stopping, you will hear the sound of fairies dancing and singing deep within the ground. Of course, it could just be the sound of the blood rushing round your dizzy head. England home to zombies? Werewolves? Green-skinned fairy folk? And how about dragons, strange monoliths and vampires? If you're fascinated by the bizarre and unexplained, join Charles on a road trip around the newly discovered walled Newton Triangle, where fact is much weirder than any fiction. Check out Charles Christian's fantastic Kindle book, A Travel Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolds, on amazon.co.uk and amazon.com.
Almost time to go, but before we do, watch out for those autumn days where although the sun may be lower in the sky, it can still be strong and bright. This is a story that happened to a friend of mine in Edinburgh about 12 years ago. He came home from work one evening in early October to find the fire brigade at the block of flats where he lived. To his dismay, he discovered his neighbour's apartment had been gutted by fire, but fortunately the neighbour hadn't been in the building when the fire started, so he was safe and, equally fortuitously, because the apartment block was an old stone-built construction, my friend's flat was untouched by the blaze. Then came the inevitable forensic investigation into the cause of the fire. According to the fire brigade, the blaze started when sunlight, concentrated by a crystal ball, yes, I did say a crystal ball, on the neighbour's windowsill was focused, as if through a magnifying glass, onto a pile of laundry that promptly caught fire. The neighbour, a student at Edinburgh University, was also an amateur psychic who used the crystal ball as a fortune-telling device. Which is kind of ironic, as he didn't see that fire coming, did he? Janie and I will be back on Thursday the 19th of October. Good night, thank you, and may your gods and goddesses protect you from ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon. Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter at urban_fantasist. Good night. Join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Urban Fantasist. The Urban Fantasist radio show is produced at Goat Pen Studios, Norfolk, England. Music by Jason Wick of Goat Pen. Find them at goatpenstudios.co.uk or on Facebook at Goat Pen Studios.